Apollo 1, the fire that changed NASA forever. On a cool Florida evening in January 1967, the future of America's space program stood poised for greatness. The rocket sat quietly on Launch Pad 34 at Cape Kennedy, its white skin glowing under floodlights, a symbol of technological power and national pride. Inside, 3 astronauts were going through what was meant to be a routine test, a full simulation of launch procedures without actually igniting the rocket engines. It wasn't supposed to be dangerous. No countdown to liftoff, no roaring flames, no voyage into the void. Just a rehearsal, another step toward the moon. They called it Apollo 1, the first mission in a new era that promised to land humans on another world. But within hours, the name Apollo 1 would become synonymous with tragedy. Inside the command module sat 3 men. Gus Grissom, veteran of Mercury and Gemini, one of NASA's most experienced astronauts. A perfectionist, tough, sometimes blunt. He had once said that spaceflight was a business for the brave and the lucky. Ed White, calm, disciplined, the first American to walk in space. He carried quiet pride and an engineer's precision. And Roger Chaffee, young, ambitious, on his first mission, the rookie who had everything to prove and the skills to back it up. 3 men bound together by a dream to take America's next leap into the unknown. That afternoon, they climbed into the spacecraft for what NASA called a plugs-out test. Every external cable that normally connected the capsule to the ground was removed. The astronauts would rely solely on the ship's internal systems, testing communication, power, and life support. It was an essential step before any flight. Inside the sealed cabin, the atmosphere was filled with pure oxygen at high pressure, standard for ground tests at the time. What no one realized was how deadly that decision would be. At 1 p.m., the astronauts took their seats. Outside, technicians monitored the test, checking systems, waiting for a clean run. But the spacecraft was temperamental. Communication lines were crackling. Grissom joked over the radio, "How are we going to get to the moon if we can't talk between 2 or 3 buildings?" Laughter echoed in the control room, the kind of light banter that hides the strain of long hours and mounting frustration. Hours passed as engineers tried to solve the glitches. By early evening, the crew was still sealed inside. The test dragged on, delayed by technical snags that seemed minor at the time. Then, at 6:31 p.m., it happened. A spark, tiny, invisible, arced from a wire beneath one of the seats. In the pure oxygen environment, it was like striking a match inside a tank of fuel. Fire erupted instantly, racing along wires, up the cabin wall, across the suits of the astronauts. "Fire in the cockpit!" The shout over the headset turned every head on the control floor. Within seconds, the temperature inside the capsule surged past 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The pressure rose so high that the inward opening hatch sealed itself tighter. The crew tried desperately to escape, but the mechanism required over 90 seconds to unlatch even under ideal conditions, and they had only seconds. Electrical systems shorted out, cables melted, communications went dead. 17 seconds after the first cry, silence fell. By the time rescue teams fought through the smoke and pried the hatch open, it was over. The astronauts were gone. Their bodies were found strapped in place, helmets cracked from heat, faces hidden behind the blackened glass. They had never left Earth. The fire shocked the nation. The same America that had cheered every launch and celebrated every spacewalk now watched in disbelief. News anchors spoke quietly, almost reverently. For the first time, the public realized that NASA's journey to the moon would not be a story of triumph alone. It would come with a price. President Lyndon B. Johnson ordered an immediate investigation. Congress demanded answers. And inside NASA, a wave of grief swept through the corridors. The engineers who had built the capsule could hardly look at their own designs. Many wept. Others worked in silence, afraid that the dream they had built was about to die with the men they lost. At the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston, Flight Director Gene Kranz gathered his team. He stood before them, pale, tired, but steady. He wrote 2 words on the chalkboard: tough and competent. He told them, "These words are the price of admission to flight control. From this day forward, every time we walk into this room, we will remember the sacrifice of those men. We will be tough and we will be competent. Nothing less." Those 2 words became the foundation of NASA's new identity. Every switch, every bolt, every procedure would be checked and double-checked. Assumptions would be questioned. Every test would be treated as life or death. The official investigation began within days. It revealed a devastating list of failures. The spacecraft, Apollo Command Module 012, was a nightmare of wiring and flammable materials. Velcro strips, nylon nets, and even checklists were all made from materials that burned easily in pure oxygen. The hatch design made rapid escape impossible. The oxygen lines leaked. And the test procedure itself, a full electrical power-up with a sealed cabin, was inherently unsafe. The more investigators looked, the clearer it became that the fire had not been a random accident. It was the result of a culture that had grown too confident, a race against the clock to beat the Soviets to the moon. Schedules mattered more than safety. Warnings had been ignored. Engineers had grown used to saying, "We'll fix it later." But later never came. As the hearings continued, NASA's leadership faced brutal scrutiny from Congress and the press. Senators accused them of arrogance, of carelessness, of forgetting that every test involved human lives. Yet in that painful process, something extraordinary happened. NASA changed. The Apollo program was paused for nearly 2 years. Thousands of design drawings were scrapped. A new spacecraft was born out of tragedy. The oxygen system was redesigned. Flammable materials were banned. The hatch was rebuilt to open outward in less than 5 seconds, and NASA created a brand new safety office with authority to stop any test at any time. For the families of Grissom, White, and Chaffee, these changes were small comfort. They had lost fathers, husbands, sons, men whose courage was as real as any hero in uniform. At Arlington National Cemetery, as the coffins were lowered into the ground, the honor guard stood in silence. There were no speeches that could fill that void, only the sound of wind and the knowledge that their sacrifice would shape the future. Out on Pad 34, the metal structure that once held Apollo 1 stood scorched and twisted. Investigators picked through the wreckage, photographing every wire, every charred fragment. When the work was done, NASA sealed the pad and left it as a memorial. To this day, a small plaque reads, "Dedicated to the living memory of the crew of Apollo 1. They gave their lives in service to their country during the quest to explore space." In the years that followed, NASA rebuilt itself piece by piece. The first successful Apollo flight, Apollo 7, launched in 1968 with a redesigned capsule that bore little resemblance to the one that had burned. Its commander, Wally Schirra, carried with him the memory of his fallen colleagues. He said before liftoff, "We fly for those who never got the chance." 2 years after the fire, humanity walked on the moon. When Neil Armstrong stepped down onto the lunar surface, he carried an Apollo 1 patch sewn inside his suit. So did Buzz Aldrin. And back on Earth, the families of Grissom, White, and Chaffee watched through tears as the dream their loved ones had died for became real. The Apollo 1 fire had not ended NASA's mission. It had purified it. Every success that followed, from Apollo 11 to the shuttle era to modern exploration, carries the fingerprint of that night in 1967. It was the night NASA learned that courage alone wasn't enough. Precision, humility, and vigilance were the new watchwords. More than half a century later, the site still stands. Pad 34 is rusting and overgrown, its concrete scarred by time. Visitors walk the ramp where the astronauts once climbed to their capsule. They look up at the plaque and whisper the names: Gus Grissom, Ed White, Roger Chaffee. The silence there feels heavier than any rocket launch, because that silence is where the modern space age truly began. Apollo 1 was not a failure of technology. It was a failure of awareness, of believing that progress alone could outrun risk. But through that failure came wisdom. The fire that took 3 lives saved countless others in the decades that followed. It forged a culture that sent men to the moon, built the space shuttle, and carried robots to Mars. It taught humanity that exploration demands not only bravery, but humility before the unknown. So when you look at the moon today, gleaming white against the night sky, remember this: before humanity could walk there, we had to learn how to stand again. And that lesson began on a launch pad in Florida, on a quiet day that turned into fire. They never made it to the stars, but because of them, the rest of us did.